Okay, so we're diving deep today into Story or Die by Lisa Cron.
Uh-huh.
And this one was flagged by you, our listener, so it's one that I know a lot of you are interested in.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's especially relevant, given all the ways we try to persuade people today.
Absolutely, and it gets at this sort of fundamental question of why some messages stick and others just,
Like totally.
disappear. Like why we remember certain things, not
Yeah.
others. And Cron, I think, gets at this in a really, really fascinating way by looking at the power of story.
Yeah, and how story kind of cuts through all the clutter and the noise.
Right, and why maybe just bombarding people with facts and figures doesn't actually work.
Right. It's not enough.
So we're going to unpack all that today, really looking at how to use story to really persuade and influence people.
Definitely.
And for folks who aren't familiar with Lisa Cron, she's kind of a, a big name in the storytelling world.
Yeah, she's a story coach, she's a speaker, she's written a number of books on narrative, including The Deep Story and Story Genius,
Hmm.
which actually had some really interesting titles when they were translated into Chinese.
Oh, really?
Yeah, something along the lines of like The Plot the Brain Can't Resist and Story Genius, which I think is kind of funny.
That's amazing. I love that.
Yeah, and she's got a ton of experience consulting for big players like Warner Bros. And the William Morris Agency.
Wow.
So she's really been in the trenches, and she's also taught at UCLA. And she headed up the Visual Narrative MFA program at the School of Visual Arts.
Wow. So she really knows her stuff.
Yeah, for sure. And she lives in Santa Monica with her husband,
Huh.
two shading cats, and what she calls her delightful yet troublesome dog.
I love that.
So she's clearly got a knack for characters.
Yeah, even the furry ones.
Exactly. And before we jump in, just a quick shout out to Du, who translated this edition.
Of course.
She's got a background in English and Japanese editing, so a big thank you to her
Yes,
for
absolutely.
making this book accessible.
So Cron starts off with this great Hopi proverb,
Yeah.
and it's so simple, but so powerful. Those who tell stories rule the world.
Wow, yeah.
And she immediately brings this to life with a story of her own about just a frustrating travel experience at LaGuardia Airport.
Oh boy, I can relate.
So picture this. Your flight's delayed, you finally land, but instead of taxiing to a gate, you're stuck on the tarmac.
The worst.
Right, and then to make matters worse, this ridiculously cheerful announcement comes on about all the amazing renovations that are planned for the airport in the future.
Oh no.
Talking about all these great things that are going to happen, but completely ignoring the fact that everyone is trapped and miserable right now.
Oh, that's so tone deaf.
It is. It's like being offered a gourmet meal a year from now when you're starving in this moment.
Total.
And that's what Cron is getting at. It's
Yeah.
that disconnect between what people are actually experiencing and what you're trying to tell them.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because in that airport example,
Yeah.
you have all these facts, about these future improvements, but they just completely miss the mark.
They do.
Because they're not addressing what people actually care about in that moment.
Right.
Which is like, get me off this plane.
I just want to get to my destination.
Exactly. And Cron points to a tweet from Emily Nussbaum that I thought was really funny.
Mhm.
She talks about the murderous looks from her fellow passengers during a similar experience.
Yeah.
And it really highlights that feeling of just being completely unheard.
Right.
You're being told about these great things that are coming, but it doesn't matter because you're stuck.
Right. And it feels like they don't even understand what you're going through.
Yeah, exactly.
And this is where Cron makes a really important point. Facts alone just aren't enough to persuade people
Uh-huh.
unless those facts connect with what people already care about.
Yeah, their existing beliefs, how they see themselves, how they see the world.
Exactly. And if you don't tap into that, then you just come across as,
Yeah,
out of touch or even worse.
like you don't care.
Like, you don't care, right?
And I think another thing about facts is that they're often abstract. They're open to interpretation. What one person sees as like a really important piece of data, another person might just dismiss.
Totally. Or even question its validity.
Exactly. And that's where story comes in.
Uh-huh.
Because story provides context. It takes those facts and puts them into a framework that helps us understand why they matter.
Yes. And it makes it personal.
It does. It makes it relatable.
Think about early humans, gathered around a fire.
Yeah.
How did they figure out what was safe and what was dangerous?
I mean, I guess trial and error, but
Well, yeah, but also through stories, right?
Oh, right.
Stories of survival, stories of loss.
Yeah, passed down through generations.
Exactly.
Yep.
And those stories would paint a much clearer picture of the consequences than just like, a list of rules.
Right, because you can actually visualize it. You can feel it.
Yes. And Cron's point is that if you want to persuade someone, you have to connect with their story, the narrative that they already have in their head.
Right, their own personal worldview.
Exactly. And to really illustrate this, she uses a really powerful example from Brazil,
Okay.
the organ donor shortage.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a huge issue.
It is, and it's a problem not just in Brazil, but globally.
Yeah.
Here in the U.S., only about 40% of people actually check that organ donor box on their driver's licenses.
That's surprising. It's lower than I would have thought.
It is, and in Brazil, it was even more complicated because they required family authorization.
Oh, wow.
So even if you had indicated you wanted to be a donor, your family could still overrule that.
Oh, gosh.
And often they did because, they were grieving and maybe they weren't aware of their loved one's wishes.
Yeah, I can see how that would happen.
So you had this serious shortage of organs.
Mm-hmm.
And they tried all sorts of campaigns, with facts and figures.
Yeah, about saving lives and civic duty.
Exactly. But the donation rates just stayed really low.
So why didn't it work?
Well, Cron suggests that these fact-based campaigns can sometimes feel like shaming.
Oh.
Like you're being told you're not doing enough.
Right. And nobody likes to feel like that.
Exactly. And people don't like being told what to do.
It can feel like a lecture.
It can, and it can make people defensive.
Makes sense.
So this advertising agency in Brazil, Ogilvy,
Okay.
they decided to try a different approach.
Okay.
They focused on something that Brazilians are deeply passionate about.
Soccer.
Soccer.
Yes.
Specifically, the Sport Club Recife fans.
Ah, those guys are intense.
Cron describes their passion as like near obsessive.
Yeah, it's almost religious.
It is. It's this lifelong commitment that transcends generations.
I've heard stories about South American soccer fans. I mean, their loyalty is legendary.
It is. And Ogilvy recognized that this passion was the key.
So how did they use it?
They asked this really powerful question. What if fans' hearts could literally continue beating for their club even after they were gone?
Wow.
What if their eyes could still watch the games?
That's a powerful image.
It is, right?
So they were appealing to their desire for eternal loyalty. I love that.
And they called the campaign Immortal Fans.
Oh, that's perfect.
And the slogan was, Sport Club Recife has the most passionate fans in Brazil, and they want to be fans forever. Now they can be.
Oh, it's so good.
And they created this incredible video featuring this young fan. Her voice is completely hoarse from cheering, and she's just declaring that the club is everything to her.
Oh, wow. I bet that resonated.
It did. And then they included these really moving testimonials from fans.
Like what?
There was this blind man who said he wanted his eyes to continue watching the team.
Oh, wow.
A young person who vowed that their lungs would keep breathing for Recife.
That's so powerful.
It is. And a woman who was just in tears saying that her heart would forever beat for the club.
Man, they really tapped into something deep there.
They did, and the fans really connected with it.
Yeah.
Cron quotes one fan who said, "Even after I die, I'm still a member of Sport Club Recife. Sport Club Recife is my soul."
Wow.
And another fan joked that if a recipient from a rival team got a Recife organ, they'd be assimilated.
That's hilarious.
It is, right? But it shows you the depth of their loyalty.
Yeah, it's not just about the organs, it's about carrying on their legacy.
Exactly. And I think that's the brilliance of this campaign,
Yeah.
It completely reframed the whole idea of death.
Right, instead of focusing on loss, it's about this continuation.
Yes, it turns fear into this promise of eternal loyalty.
That's amazing.
And the call to action was so simple.
Okay.
Get an organ donor card. You could do it online or at the games.
Okay.
And it wasn't presented as this morbid thing. It was a badge of honor.
Right away to show your commitment.
Exactly. And the fans were excited to do it.
So what were the results?
The results were incredible. By the end of the year, over 51,000 fans had signed up as organ donors.
Wow.
And that led to a 54% increase in organ donation rates.
That's huge.
It is. And for the first time ever, the waiting lists for heart and cornea transplants in that region dropped to 0.
No way, that's incredible.
It is. And the impact continued. The next year, they issued over 66,000 more cards.
That's amazing.
And the campaign inspired similar efforts in other countries.
Wow, so it really made a lasting impact.
It did. And I think the big takeaway for our listener is that if you want to really persuade someone, You have to connect with their existing narrative.
Right. Not just hit them with facts and figures.
Exactly. You have to make it personal and appeal to their values.
And their emotion.
And their emotions, yeah.
Because ultimately, we make decisions based on how we feel.
We do, and that brings us to the really fascinating part of Cron's book where she dives into the brain science behind all of this.
Okay.
Why are stories so powerful?
Yeah, I'm curious to hear more about that.
Well, it all starts with this basic truth that it's incredibly difficult to change someone's mind about anything.
Oh, yeah, I've definitely experienced that.
We've all been there, right? Whether it's something major like political beliefs or even just, try and convince your friend to try a new restaurant.
Right.
We present what seems like irrefutable logic and clear benefits.
Yeah.
And they're just not budging. And it's so frustrating.
It is, but Cron argues that this isn't just because people are stubborn.
Okay.
It's actually deeply rooted in how our brains are wired.
Oh, interesting.
Our brains have evolved over millennia to prioritize survival. And that means developing these incredibly efficient filters for processing information.
So we're not constantly overwhelmed.
Exactly. And those filters are really good at screening out anything that doesn't seem immediately relevant.
Makes sense.
So just presenting new information, even if it's logically sound, often just doesn't get through.
Because it doesn't trigger that survival instinct.
Right.
So how do we get past those filters?
Well, that's where understanding how the brain works is so important.
Okay.
Cron argues that story is not just a way to persuade people, it's the most effective way.
Wow.
Because it taps into something much deeper than just logic.
Emotion.
Yes, emotion. And this was a real aha moment for Cron herself. She realized that what really hooked her in stories
wasn't just the plot or the characters, it was how the events in the story affected the protagonist's beliefs.
Oh, interesting.
How they changed as a result of their experiences.
So it's about that internal transformation.
Exactly. And it's not just anecdotal.
Yeah.
Cron backs this up with research from neuroscience, cognitive psychology, evolutionary biology.
Wow, so there's real science behind this.
There is, and she explains why stories are so powerful, why they have this unique ability to change how we see things.
That's fascinating.
It is, and she outlines 3 key parts of her book that we're going to be diving into in future episodes.
Okay.
First, how our brains connect with stories. Second, understanding your audience and your persuasive goals.
Right.
And third, how to actually craft your own persuasive stories.
I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, and she comes back to this key point that people don't change just because they're told to.
Right.
They change because they want to.
Because it feels right.
Because it feels right, and that's the magic of story.
Yeah, it can bypass those intellectual defenses.
It can, and speak directly to our hearts.
To our emotions.
To our emotions, yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about how our brains actually handle all the information that's thrown at us every day.
Right, because it's a lot.
It's a ton. Cron calls it the cognitive unconscious.
Okay.
And she describes it as like this guardian that's constantly filtering out all the irrelevant stuff.
So it's like our brain's spam filter.
Exactly. And, there's that classic statistic about a Sunday edition of the New York Times.
Oh, yeah. Containing more information than a medieval peasant would encounter in their entire life.
Right. And that was before the internet.
Oh, my gosh, right.
Now we're just inundated with information constantly.
Overwhelming.
It is. We're talking about 11 million bits of information per second bombarding our senses.
11 million.
11 million.
That's insane.
It is. And think about how many decisions we make every day.
Oh, gosh. So many.
Cron says it's around 35,000 decisions.
35,000.
And over 200 of those are just about food.
Just about food.
Just about food. So you can see why choosing what to eat for dinner can feel so stressful sometimes.
Oh, my gosh. Yeah, right.
Because our brains are just overloaded.
They are.
But here's the thing. We only consciously process a very small percentage of all that.
Oh, really?
Yeah, maybe around 70 of those 35,000 decisions.
Wow.
And often those are the more trivial ones.
Okay.
And out of those 11 million bits of information per second, we can only consciously pay attention to about 40 at any given time.
That's incredible.
Our brains have to be incredibly selective.
So how do they do it?
Well, Cron says our brains are basically asking this one question constantly. Is this relevant to me?
Is this relevant to me?
Will it affect me?
Will it affect me?
Do I need to pay attention?
Do I need to pay attention?
And if the answer is no, it gets filtered out.
That makes sense.
It has to, otherwise we'd be completely overwhelmed.
We would, yeah.
And then there's the thinking brain, which is the prefrontal cortex. And this is the part of our brain that handles complex reasoning, planning, decision-making.
Okay.
But it's also slow, and it uses a lot of energy.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it only makes up about 2% of our body weight, but it can consume up to 25% of our energy, when we're really focused.
Wow.
So it's reserved for tasks that our unconscious can't handle immediately, like long-term financial decisions or really complex survival strategies.
So it's like the strategic planning department.
Exactly.
Okay.
Whereas the unconscious is more like the rapid response team.
Got it.
It's acting on instinct to protect us from immediate danger.
So like when you slam on the brakes when you see a car suddenly stop in front of you.
Exactly. You react before you even have time to think about it.
Right.
It's pure survival instinct.
And this is why it's so hard to persuade people with just facts and figures.
Right, because if it doesn't connect with their immediate sense of self-interest,
Yeah.
it's just going to get filtered out.
It's going to get lost in the noise.
Exactly. So we need a way to bypass those filters and grab their attention.
And that's where story comes in.
Exactly.
So tell me more about why story is so essential for persuasion.
Well, first of all, story is ancient.
Yeah.
It predates written language by a long shot.
Uh-huh.
And it was a vital survival tool long before we started thinking of it as fiction or entertainment.
That's interesting.
And Cron argues that we don't actually create stories, we discover them.
Discover them.
Yeah, because story is the way our brains naturally make sense of the world.
Oh, I see.
It's how we analyze information and understand our experiences.
So it's like our brain's operating system.
Exactly. And the key question our brains are asking constantly is, how does this affect me in terms of my goals?
How does this affect me?
Yeah. And initially, those goals were pretty basic. Survival, finding food, avoiding predators.
Right.
But as we've evolved, our goals have become more complex.
Getting a good job or
Exactly.
raising a family.
Yeah, or even just like saving for retirement.
Right.
But the underlying principle is the same. It's all about self-interest.
We're all the protagonists of our own stories.
We are, and we measure everything based on its impact on us.
How does this affect me?
Exactly. And that's why Cron uses that analogy of the airplane oxygen mask,
Put on your own mask before helping others.
Yeah, because if you don't take care of yourself first, you can't help anyone else.
Right.
And our unconscious minds are constantly on the lookout for threats and opportunities.
They are.
It's all about survival.
So how does this relate to the meaning we assign to things?
Well, Cron uses this great example of rain.
Okay.
So imagine a farmer who's in the middle of a severe drought.
Okay.
For that farmer, rain is a blessing.
Right. It means survival.
Exactly. But now imagine a couple who's planned an elaborate outdoor wedding. For them, rain is a disaster.
Right. It ruins everything.
And what's interesting is that even within those scenarios, there can be deeper stories at play.
Oh, like what?
Well, maybe the farmer secretly hates farming, and he's hoping the drought will force him to sell his land.
Oh, wow.
Or maybe the father of the bride disapproves of the marriage, and he's secretly relieved that the rain might disrupt the wedding.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Right. So the meaning of an event isn't objective.
It's subjective.
It's subjective. It depends entirely on the context, the stories surrounding it.
So it's all about perspective.
Exactly. And if we can't figure out how something relates to our own goals,
Yeah.
if it doesn't have any clear meaning for us,
Then we just tune it out.
we tune it out, our brains filter it as irrelevant.
It's like white noise.
Exactly.
So if story is so important for persuasion, why do we so often overlook it?
That's a good question. Cron says there are two main reasons.
Okay.
First, we have this illusion of objective reality.
The illusion of objective reality.
Yeah, we tend to think that we see the world objectively,
Right.
and we assume that other reasonable people will see things the same way we do.
Right, because it seems so obvious to us.
Exactly. But the truth is, our perception is always shaped by our own experiences.
And by our own stories.
By our own stories, exactly. And that's why what seems crystal clear to us might be completely confusing to someone else.
Because they haven't lived our life.
Exactly. They haven't had the same experiences. They don't have the same context.
And Cron uses that great fish joke from David Foster Wallace's This Is Water,
Oh, yeah, I love that one.
where the young fish asks the older fish, what the hell is water?
Right, because they're so immersed in it, they don't even recognize it.
Exactly. And our own personal stories are our water.
They shape how we see everything.
And if we don't understand that, then we're going to have a hard time connecting with other people.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that's the first reason we overlook the power of story. What's the second reason?
The second reason is that we tend to think of story as just entertainment.
Just entertainment.
Yeah, something we do to relax after a long day.
Right, to escape from reality.
Exactly. But Cron argues that story is much more than that. She says it's more important than our opposable thumbs.
More important than our opposable thumbs.
Yeah, because thumbs let us grab things. But stories tell us what to grab.
Oh, I see.
They give us, meaning they help us make sense of the world.
Right.
And she describes story as the first virtual reality.
The first virtual reality.
Yeah, because it allows us to experience things we wouldn't otherwise be able to experience.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, it allows us to imagine the future.
Okay.
Without story, we'd only be aware of the present moment.
We wouldn't be able to plan or anticipate.
Exactly. And we also wouldn't have a past.
Oh, why?
Without story, we wouldn't have any memories.
So story is essential for both our past and our future.
It gives us a sense of continuity.
And it helps us learn.
Exactly. Think about that Stone Age person trying to decide whether or not to eat those red berries.
Right.
If they've heard a story about someone else getting sick from eating those berries, they're going to be much less likely to eat them themselves.
Right. It's a safe way to learn from other people's mistakes.
Cool. Exactly. And the fact that we enjoy stories so much.
Yeah. Why is that?
Well, Cron says it's because story was so crucial for our survival.
So it's not just for fun.
It's not just for fun, it's a biological imperative.
Wow.
And she explains how compelling stories trigger the release of dopamine in our brains.
Dopamine.
Yeah, it's a neurotransmitter associated with pleasure and reward.
Okay.
So when we hear a good story, our brains are like, hey, this is important, pay attention.
And that makes us more likely to remember it.
Exactly. And stories also release other neurochemicals, like cortisol, which signals caution,
Okay.
and oxytocin, which promotes empathy and connection.
So stories are literally changing our brain chemistry.
They are. They're having a real physical effect on us.
That's amazing.
It is. And the fact that our brains would even risk being distracted by stories in the past.
Yeah, when distraction could be dangerous.
Exactly. It shows you how important story is.
Right. It had to have a significant evolutionary advantage.
It did. It was worth the risk.
Okay, so we've talked about why stories are so powerful, but we haven't really talked about why we're so drawn to them.
Right. Why do we love to hear stories?
Why are we so fascinated by gossip?
Yeah, why do we spend so much time reading novels and watching movies?
It's like we can't resist a good story.
We can.
Yeah.
And Cron says it all comes back to our social nature.
Okay.
You know, as humans, we're wired to connect with others.
Right, we're social creatures.
We are. And without those close-knit social groups, those tribes, we wouldn't have survived.
Right.
I mean, think about it. We're not the biggest or the strongest animals out there.
No, we're not.
But we're incredibly social.
And that's our strength.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Our ability to cooperate and work together is what allowed us to thrive.
Right.
And that need to belong to a group is as fundamental as our need for food or water.
It's a biological imperative.
It is. And our brains have evolved to reflect that. Cron mentions Matthew Lieberman's book, Social, Why Our Brains Are Wired to Connect, which argues that the growth of the human brain was driven primarily by our need for social cognitive skills.
So not just intelligence, but social intelligence.
Exactly. Understanding other people, reading their emotions, navigating social situations.
That makes sense.
And this idea is supported by other thinkers, like Yuval Noah Harari in *Sapiens* and Michael Gazzaniga, who's a neuroscientist.
Okay.
Gazzaniga has even said that the brain's primary function is social processing.
Wow, so our brains are literally wired for connection.
They are, and stories are the tools we use to make those connections.
Oh, I see.
Stories help us understand other people's thoughts, feelings, beliefs.
They give us social wisdom.
Exactly. They teach us how to navigate the social world.
And they help us understand ourselves.
They do. They help us make sense of our own experiences.
So stories are not just about escaping reality, they're about understanding reality.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's talk about the role of gossip.
Okay.
Because we often think of gossip as a bad thing.
Right. It has a negative connotation.
It does, but Cron argues that gossip actually served an important evolutionary purpose.
Oh, really?
Yeah, she says it was a way to enforce social norms within those small tribal groups.
Oh, I see.
You know, back when our ancestors were living in groups of less than 150 people.
Right, like Dunbar's number.
Exactly. And in those small groups, survival depended on everyone cooperating.
Yeah, you couldn't afford to have freeloaders.
Exactly. And gossip was a way to hold people accountable.
So it's like a form of social pressure.
It was. And it could be incredibly effective because being ostracized from the tribe could mean death.
That's a powerful motivator.
It is, and we still have that fear of social pain today.
We do. Cron mentions Naomi Eisenberger's research at UCLA, which shows that social pain activates the same areas of the brain as physical pain.
Wow, so it's like a real physical sensation.
It is, and that's why it's so hard to go against the beliefs of our group.
Because it literally hurts.
Because it literally hurts.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Cron's point is that if you want to persuade someone, you can't just hit them with facts that contradict their worldview.
Right, because that's going to trigger that social pain response.
Exactly. You have to find a way to align your message with their existing beliefs.
To tell a story that resonates with their values.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this first deep dive into story or die, let's recap some of the key takeaways.
I could tell.
First, we learn that our brains are constantly bombarded with information.
Right.
And they have to filter out anything that's not perceived as essential for survival.
And that filtering happens unconsciously.
It does, so we're not even aware of it most of the time.
Right.
And that's why facts alone often fail to persuade us.
Because they don't trigger that survival instinct.
Exactly.
And that's where story comes in.
It does, because story is the language of the brain.
Is how we make sense of the world.
It's how we learn.